Michele, thank you for accepting my invitation.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'm glad to be on the show today.
You have recently published a book titled Beyond Emotional Intelligence. And emotional intelligence is a term that is widely used in the corporate world. I would say so used that I suspect many people don't really grasp the meaning of these two words. Shall we start explaining exactly what emotional intelligence really means?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the $1,000,000 question, really, that I've been exploring over the course of my career. And we do have a traditional definition, sort of a historical definition of it, of being aware of one's own emotions and the impact our emotions have on us and other people, aware of other people's emotions and the impact that that has in turn on us and other people. So that's sort of a traditional definition, but I'm not really a very traditional person. I like to ask the deeper questions of what is it really? And so when I started this work way back when and looked at the most popularized model of emotional intelligence, which is the Goleman-Boyatzis model, there are 4 domains in that 12 competencies. That's a lot of stuff to be good at. So I wanted to know, where do you start? Is there a certain set of skills, for example, that I should focus on that will cause me to be good at all of these other things that are important to emotional intelligence? And that's really that question is what led me on the journey that I've been on years in particular to find the answer to that question. And so I'm happy to share more of what I've discovered in that, because it's a pretty profound process that I've been through. And it's led to a more precise definition of EI for me, which has to entail some baseline knowledge of how the brain and the body and perception itself works. And so I think in the essence of understanding all of these elements that allow us to actually embody what it means to be emotionally intelligent, and not just understand it intellectually.
And not just intelligent intellectually. And I've read your book, and I'd love to explore this body of work with you during this podcast today. However, there's a question that I'd like to ask you. Why do you think the corporate world has embraced the very idea of emotional intelligence so much, at least at a superficial level? And so that's my first question. But the second question is, has the corporate world really embraced emotional intelligence, or is it just a superficial thing for now?
Yeah, great question. Oof. The business world a long time to warm up to the idea of emotional. We look at when, for example, Daniel Goleman popularized the concept of emotional intelligence. It was in 1995, a good 25 plus years ago. And I remember at that time reading his book and being so excited, like, this is what we need. We need this. And the leaders that I worked with at that time were kind of poo-pooing it, to be honest. Like, let's read good to great. Forget this emotional intelligence stuff. But that was then. I think what's changed now, so much has changed, but I think why people have emotional intelligence wholeheartedly is because there is wisdom really that resonates at a very human level, people, in terms of how we articulate what emotional intelligence means, right? In terms of self-awareness and empathy and compassion. Who doesn't want those things? Who doesn't need those things? And so because it's been a model that's been largely built for the leadership community in a language would understand around competencies and behaviors, which is how the business world speaks about performance, I think this is what's really allowed leaders and businesses to embrace these ideas. But now for the second part of your question, which I think is really important, in, working in businesses for the last 25, 30 years in senior level positions is that, we could talk all day long about recipe or the ingredients or the behaviors and competencies and not actually have the people learn how to do these things and embody things. So there was a gap in my, experience between people's enjoyment and even aspiration to be emotionally intelligent and their capacity to bring that about for themselves. So that's really where my work has particularly 6 years since starting this business, and really looking at what are the practices, what micro techniques that actually allow someone to become more emotionally intelligent. And I think, honestly speaking, that's where the field is at now, in terms of what does it mean to embody these qualities and not just put them on a chart in fancy bubbles, which is a nice start. It's a nice start.
It is. Quoting your book, emotions are the center of human existence, and yet they are invisible. For this reason, emotions often dominate people without them being aware. In the book, you present 12 self-discoveries, a sort of template to help people identify the various emotions and mental pitfalls. Would you like to share this template with our audience today?
Sure, absolutely. So this came about well before the book was written and well before our coaching certification program came about. And they are really from my observations of coaching hundreds of leaders over decades, and mostly in business settings across many industries, many levels of the organization. And what I found were these themes where people would get stuck again mentally, like these mental habits that would keep them from either seeing who they really were or what's keeping them stuck, as the key to unlock how is it that you get unstuck once you see that you are. And so these themes emerged and put into the format of the 12 self-discoveries, and frankly, learned the most about because of my own practice and be a better practitioner of emotional intelligence, and getting coached myself and seeing what keeps me stuck. What are these that can happen, and how can we turn them into allies when we understand what's really going on in terms of our habitual ways of perceiving reality and what's happening and unfolding. And so an example of the 12 self-discovery: empty your head trash. Now that's something that everybody can relate to. It's, we each have somehow this habit of being self-deprecating towards ourselves in various moments of our lives, and secretly having some fears or beliefs about ourselves that aren't that charitable. We can, of course, have uncharitable ideas about other people too, and we do quite frequently, but we also have them about ourselves. And so this idea of emptying our head trash is one, knowing that it's there to begin with, and often takes the form, for example, of self-talk, negative self-talk, which we may or may not actually iterate from our mouths, but it's there and we're thinking it. And so the moment that we see that, wow, I'm caught in one of these moments, there's an opportunity, an invitation to say something different, to believe something yourself that enables you to be at your best and to go after the things that you might not otherwise if you think you're going to fail.
That's very interesting.
That's just an example.
That's very interesting, Michele. I've practiced myself meditation for quite a few years. I'm trying to be as conscious as possible of my thoughts and keep the trash away or as far as possible. However, one of the things that I struggle with, and I think many other people, is to do that in the heat of the moment during real life, When you sit and have the time to reflect and meditate, then you can really look at every individual thought and try and manage them. But what happens when one of those disempowering thoughts comes along in a moment where you don't have the luxury to sit and reflect? What do you do?
Sure. Great question. Look, I think there is no, how do we put this? There's no practice or way we can prevent negative thoughts from coming up. But there is so much we can do to work with them. And it doesn't necessarily require the time to have reflection. It does require that we recognize and right, because if we don't see it, we can't really do anything about it. And so whatever ends up happening will just be within our repertoire, normally respond to those types of cues in our lives. So the moment that we notice, okay, this feeling is for me, or this self-deprecating, or we could even just say a negative mental state, right? Could be a negative thought, a negative feeling, a negative sensation, or whatever it is, however it's manifesting for you. First noticing it. And then let's just explore here right now 2-3 different ways work with that mental state, because it's temporary for one, and even though something might be a reoccurring mental state, it does have an end point. That's the good news. That's where impermanence is a good thing. So one practice that's quite simple, nobody even needs to know that you're doing it, is just breathing. You literally, as you're breathing in the moment, you can envision kind of spaciousness into your own awareness and mindset at that moment, because our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions are taking place where? Somehow invisibly, but perceptibly within our own mind stream. And so we can use the bodily sensation we are experiencing in the moment as signals like, hey, something's coming and it's here. Now, how am I going to deal with it? So even just that invitation to bring a spaciousness to how we might respond, what we might say in the moment, allows us to have some perspective of changing what we're focused on. Because often when we do experience a negative mental state, there's a tightening and over focusing on that sensation or on that experience in that moment. And it's like having a tight fist. And somehow in that moment, we need to redirect our focus and find the spaciousness that's already there, our own mind stream that allows many things to be present at once, not just to focus on one thing, which in this case is a particular mental state, where the breath not only provides just a few moments that you need, a few seconds, but actually also invites that sort of more space symbolically. So that's one way to work with an emotion. There are others too, but I've been talking for a while, so.
You've been talking for a while, and I found it extremely interesting, especially because it's practical. And I like the idea of providing also practical advice to our listeners, because we know time is limited for almost everybody today. So if in the short span of time that they dedicate to the show, they can also find something that they can use and improve the quality of their life, that will be an amazing result. However, Michele, every time I address the topic of self-awareness let's say the importance of try and clean our minds as much as possible, I reckon that some people have reached a level of desperation and disappointment of their life that they're actually afraid, scared to death by the idea of simply sitting and reflecting on their life condition. Mm-hmm. And those are the people I struggle to convince, so to speak. How do you see it?
Well, look, we all have both the privilege as well as sometimes the task of being with our own minds we are with our own mind more than any other thing in this life, any other person. We always have our mind. And so when you look at how is it that we can make this mind a kinder, calmer, clearer space, if for no one else but ourselves, then that's a beautiful thing. And so when we look at what is it that we actually have agency over, what is it that we can intervene on our own behalf? These are the practices of emotional intelligence and of really what I'm not just writing about in the book, of the programs and offerings that we create for our clients are about allowing someone to recognize what they already intrinsically have available to them. So in my best estimation and experience, what I like to say is the smallest common denominator of what we agency over. We don't have to go buy it. In fact, we can't buy it. We don't have to go somewhere else to find it because it's not outside of ourselves. It is our own awareness. It is the smallest common denominator of what gives us agency and an ability to direct, place, hold, read our attention, and to let the qualities of awareness itself unfold. But in order to do that, it means we actually do need to look, and not just once or twice, but pretty consistently connect with what's already there. And that is a practice in and of itself. And to get back to sort of the heart of your question, someone who is perseverating or stuck or ruminating on all of the things about life that are unpleasant and that do happen on a daily basis for each of us in our lives, the question I would ask them is, do you want your mind to be different? Do you want a better space for yourself? And if the answer is yes, the good news is you can have that.
As I was reading your book, and as I'm listening to you now, it appears to me that your work is somehow influenced by Buddhism. If that is the case, what are the lessons taught by Buddha that people can use to go beyond emotional intelligence?
Yeah. So the reason that the book is titled Beyond Emotional Intelligence is because emotional intelligence is a baseline, no question about it. But we have to be able to deal skillfully with all of our perceptions. And emotions are a sensory-based perception, right? And we need to learn how to put it all together, right? It's not good enough, for example, when you are a cook to just have the ingredients. You need the recipe, and then you need to make the meal, and then you need to eat the meal. If you do just a portion of those things, then it isn't very satisfying, right? So it's the same thing really with emotional intelligence. And the aspect of Buddhism, I would say, that comes in to my work by necessity, because I've been practicing this since I was 20, and I'm clearly not 20 anymore. I am much older than that. Is this element of pointing out what we each already have available to us. And it doesn't really matter what religion you are, what philosophy you adhere to in life. There's no denying that we have consciousness at this point in time, whether we call it awareness, attention, mindfulness, the mind, whatever you want to call it. It is awake, it's aware, it's intelligent, we can perceive, we all have this. But because it's the mechanism by which we perceive reality, it's so close that we don't notice we have it. And because we don't notice we have it, we don't think about it as a method. We don't think about it as our greatest asset that allows us to have agency and influence in our own lives. But this is sort of a nice way to sort of summarize, to say, look, when people think about habits, they normally think about diet and exercise, or how much sleep I get or don't get, or, do I interrupt people? Do I need to be kinder? All of these things. But the link that is usually not made is with what gives us the impetus in the first instance to do or change any behavior whatsoever, whether it's an external shift, or whether it's, a momentary shift in how we place and hold our attention and how we focus and what we decide we're going to, occupy our time with, even mentally, right? So going back to your example of someone who's suffering or someone who is in a difficult moment, which of course we all have been, I am still, it's knowing what's happening, acknowledging, feeling what's happening, but not letting it rule you. You get to decide how long you're going to allow any given temporary mental state to be present, to occupy the space that is really intrinsically yours, which is your own mind.
Wow. Yeah, that's so true. And one of the things the things that strikes me the most, and you also mention it in your book, is how people focus and try hard to change the things they can't change, and they totally neglect those small changes that would be under their control, that could literally improve the quality of their life. Why is that?
I think it's a little bit of what I mentioned before, that the mechanism that we have is our awareness. And on top of that, one layer above that is what I call sense making. And it's what we do as humans all the time, but we do it so instantaneously and imperceptibly and on an ongoing basis that it doesn't occur to us that we have influence at that level. And so we completely miss the inflection points of where we could actually intervene on our own behalf. And because it takes practice over a meaningful period of time, I think we like quick fixes as humans. And we want something we can purchase, do, check the box on, be done with.
Bye-bye.
On to the next thing. That's not how this works. Because if you really want to have maximal agency, then you need to work with the building blocks of perception itself, which it turns out is your own awareness. And it turns out it's how you make sense of your perceptions. And even though the brain curates already so much for us on a pre-conscious basis, we also sort of forget that once we receive, we're the beneficiaries of what our brain curates for us. So, but once we receive them, then what? It's often a conscious moment where we can either go down kind of the rabbit hole or a downward spiral more and see how far we can go. Or we can say at that moment, yes, and there are other things possible with how I'm going to perceive this. Is this even a conducive way to perceive what's happening? Is it conducive for my relationship with this person? Is it conducive for my relationship with myself? And if it isn't, because emotion is constructed, that which is constructed can be deconstructed and reconstructed.
You mentioned the fact that people like quick fixes. So true. And sometimes we also need them. Let's be realistic. A few tips here and there may help improve, if not the quality of our life, at least the day. So let's assume that one of our listeners today is a manager who's being inspired by your words, who's considering introducing more emotional intelligence in the way they conduct their business and their team.
Nice.
What would be one thing that they could start from today to ensure that they provide more understanding and more empathy, and the team as well responds in the correct way? Something simple, practical, for today only.
Right. Okay. So there are a couple ways I could tackle this question. So I'll try to do it in a way where a person can just walk away with a practice. Ultimately, I think, if we really want to do this, we have to learn a little bit more deeply about how the brain and body and perception work, so we can repeat it, because otherwise it's left up to our memory and habit. And if we don't have the habit, we won't remember it again. So that said, in terms of empathy and compassion, I really like the practice that, one of our faculty members who also just wrote a book that's amazing. His name is Matt Taylor. He talks about, in fact, the name of his company is Noble Story, but he talks about the noble story. And what that is it's a quick way to remember how we choose to make sense of any given situation or set of perceptions or emotions that we're having in the moment. And so, for example, if our brain happens to curate for us an uncharitable interpretation, which it often does, right? It often does that. We can then recognize that and say, I wonder if that's true. And really push back in that moment on whatever your brain may have curated for you that's uncharitable and say, what would be a noble story? What would be 2 reasons this person would do this thing the way they have or respond the way they have? And if I were to sort of shift my point of view and imagine that they have good intention, that they, I'm assuming positive intent, right? In sort of that unconditional positive regard that Carl Rogers talks about. What would be the noble story I could offer and honor this person with in this moment, which wouldn't necessarily be, sort of that knee-jerk reaction, uncharitable interpretation of what's just happened. So challenging yourself to see something positive and right and this unconditional positive regard, that's a practice in and of itself.
It's beautiful. Let me ask you one last question before thanking you for this very inspiring conversation. When COVID hit us so hard, the first few months, I had the impression that all this work of awareness, progress, was finally paying interests. I thought we would have get out of it better people. The first month or two, I really had this impression. I was not in my home country, Italy, but I was following what was going on in Italy at the time, and it was the country that was hit the most in the Western world. And I really had this impression that we could have emerged out of it better people. Then COVID, I don't say it passed, but we are in a much better phase today. However, the war in Ukraine, just to mention one, these markets that are crumbling, a lot of injustice and unfairness. Yeah. Are you still positive that emotional intelligence, to mention one, can make an impact? Or have we gone backwards?
Yeah, the world is a crazy place. And I ask myself every day, how is it that I can make a positive difference with what I have control over? And I think this is the challenge of looking at the bigger global landscape, because what we see are still the manifestation of many things gone wrong, and where people aren't exercising what they have agency over for the benefit of self and others. And so there's a misalignment of not only values, but if you really look at it, it's a misalignment or misperception of what would be in the best interest of other beings and not prioritizing that. And I think really the root cause or the way to get at sort of the culprit, as it were, is truly, I think, understanding how we shape our perception of reality is a huge, huge piece of this work of unraveling what I like to call the lineages of sense making. And simply put, that's how we were raised, what we were taught to believe, what was modeled for us. That deeply shapes and influences how we perceive what's happening in every new moment, how the brain takes its best guess of what will happen next. And why the heck does that matter? Because it influences how we're going to respond and how we will ultimately arrive at our futures. And so when we look at the world in a kind of mayhem or situations that make zero sense, this is really the case of not identifying on an individual and then societal kind of collective level the beliefs that inform the actions of a conflict, any conflict, whether it's the one in Ukraine, whether it's the one leading to these mass shootings in the US that are insane, right? So I kind of have this view, and I say this in the book too. We need to do our inner work, and we need to create the outer conditions by way of policy and education to support the kind of change that will get us to the future we all want to be a part of. So I always take the position, even though it can be depressing at times to see what's actually happening in the world, that we still do have our agency as individuals. And that agency, even if it's just our awareness, is so profound. It's what we have to work with, each of us, irrespective of our outer circumstances. We each at least have that internal circumstance to work with.
We do. Beside your book, Beyond Emotional Intelligence, is there any other resources, be them books, video, TED speeches, that you would recommend to the listeners who may be intrigued by our conversation today?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I have those who've inspired me who I think are just phenomenal. And one of them is Lisa Feldman Barrett. She really is leading the way relative to the neuroscience of emotion being constructed. And so I'd recommend any of her work, any of her talks. She has many, and 2 books that are out there, How Emotions Are Made, and I think 7.5 Lessons of the Brain. I would also recommend Leonard Mlodinow. He's one of my favorites. He's been so inspiring to me. First of all, anything he writes is completely worth reading. He's a physicist. He used to work with Stephen Hawking. And he's just written a book that I would say is sort of the counterpart in many ways to the neuroscience of emotions. And it's called Emotional. It came out in February. And he looks at sort of what's the historical understanding we have of the brain and the emotion, and the disservice really that we've done ourselves relative to our training around emotion, and how we can do better, and really an invitation to do better. And so, those 2 authors in particular, I find really inspirational. So.
Thank you very much. Grazie mille, Michele Nevarez, for being on Lux and Friends.
Thank you as well.